Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the wizarding world to uncover one of its most haunting and forbidden mysteries. What did the Dark Lord himself experience in those final moments at Hogwarts? Not the destruction of his body, but the journey of his fractured soul through realms that exist beyond death itself. Picture this: the most feared wizard in history, the man who split his soul 7 times to escape death, finally faces the one thing he spent his entire existence running from. But death, as Dumbledore once said, is not the end. It's merely the next great adventure. And for Tom Riddle, that adventure would become his most terrifying trial yet. What happens when someone who has never known love suddenly sees it clearly for the first time? What does a soul that has been shattered and scattered across objects and time experience when it's finally forced to confront itself in its entirety? Tonight, we'll walk through the liminal space between life and death, where even the most powerful dark magic cannot hide the truth of what we truly are. This isn't just another Harry Potter story. This is the untold account of a journey that takes place in the span of a heartbeat, yet spans the entire lifetime of the boy who became a monster. It's the story of King's Cross Station, but not the one Harry Potter saw. This is the version reserved for those whose souls have been torn apart by their own choices, where the only companion is the echo of what they could have been. So before we begin this journey together into the deepest mysteries of magic and mortality, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's exploration into the final moments of the most complex villain in all of literature. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the wizarding world, because we have so many more hidden secrets to uncover together. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and tell me which Harry Potter character's final moments you'd like to explore next. I love seeing our global community of fans come together for these stories. Now, get comfortable. Maybe brew some tea, settle into your favorite reading nook, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about redemption, choice, and the true nature of the soul. Let's begin tonight's journey into the final moments of Tom Riddle, the boy who became Voldemort, and discover what he saw when he finally met death face to face. The Great Hall of Hogwarts had never been quieter. The ancient stone walls, which had witnessed 1,000 years of laughter, learning, and life, now stood sentinel over a scene of impossible stillness. The battle was over. The war was won, and in the center of it all, the body of the most feared wizard in history lay motionless, his red eyes finally closed, his pale hands finally still. But this is not the story of Tom Riddle's death. This is the story of what happened next. Because death, you see, is not an ending. It's a doorway, and for someone who had spent decades fracturing his soul, hiding pieces of himself in objects scattered across the world, that doorway would lead somewhere no living wizard had ever imagined. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between the final echo of the killing curse and the silence that followed, Tom Riddle's consciousness found itself somewhere impossible, somewhere that existed not in the physical world, but in the space between what was and what could have been, a place where the very architecture shifted and changed based on the observer's deepest fears and most hidden truths. He was standing on platform 9 3/4, but it was wrong. Everything was wrong. The familiar Victorian ironwork stretched endlessly in all directions, creating a maze of platforms that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The air itself hummed with a strange ethereal quality, as if the very atoms were singing a song just beyond the range of human hearing. And there in the distance, barely visible through the supernatural mist that clung to everything like memories half forgotten, was the sound of crying. Soft, pitiful crying, like a child who had lost everything and had no hope of ever finding it again. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the endless metal and stone, in a way that made Tom's very soul ache with a pain he had never allowed himself to feel. It was the sound of absolute despair, of innocence corrupted, of potential destroyed, and somehow, Impossibly, he knew that the crying was coming from him, not from his body, which lay cooling in the great hall miles away and worlds apart, but from some deeper part of himself, some fragment of his soul that had been buried so deeply beneath layers of hatred and fear and ambition that he had forgotten it existed at all. The part of him that had once been a boy named Tom, who had dreamed of greatness not born from darkness, but from the simple human desire to be loved and to belong. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the death of a body, but with the awakening of a soul that had been fractured and scattered, hidden and denied, but could never truly be destroyed. Because even in the darkest magic, even in the most twisted spells of immortality, there remains one truth that cannot be changed. We are all, in the end, exactly who we choose to be. And in this place between life and death, where the normal rules of magic and reality bend and break, Tom Riddle would finally be forced to confront the most terrifying truth of all, who he had chosen to become, and who he could have been instead. The crying in the distance grew louder, more insistent, and with each sob the mist began to clear, revealing secrets that had been buried for over 50 years. Tonight we discover what Voldemort saw when he died, and in doing so we'll uncover truths about love, choice, and redemption that go to the very heart of what makes us human. The journey begins now, in a place where time has no meaning, and where the only compass is the truth of our own hearts. The crying echoed through the impossible station, and Tom Riddle took his first step toward a reckoning that had been waiting for him his entire life. The liminal space that existed between life and death had its own peculiar rules, ones that defied everything Tom Riddle had learned about magic in his 71 years of existence. Here, in this impossible version of King's Cross Station, time moved like honey through winter air, thick and golden and strange. Minutes could stretch into hours, or hours could collapse into heartbeats, depending on the weight of the memories being examined. The platform beneath his feet felt solid enough, warm stone and iron, that had seen countless travelers pass through on their way to destinations unknown. But when Tom looked down, he could see through the ground itself, layers upon layers of history stretching down into depths that seemed to have no end. He could see the original construction of the station, the first trains that had ever run these tracks, the countless goodbyes and hellos that had echoed through these halls over more than a century of human passage. And deeper still, he could see something else entirely. The bedrock of London, yes, but also the bedrock of something far more fundamental, the foundation upon which all choices were built, all souls were forged, all love was either nurtured or destroyed. It was as if the station existed not just in the physical world, but in the metaphysical one as well, a crossroads where the deepest truths about human nature could finally be examined without the distractions of flesh and blood, and the desperate need to survive. The mist that clung to everything here was not ordinary fog, but something far more profound. It was made of memory itself, of moments that had been forgotten or suppressed, of feelings that had been buried so deeply they had become part of the unconscious landscape of the soul. As Tom moved through it, wisps of the mist would occasionally coalesce into shapes that seemed almost familiar. A woman's face, kind but worn by sorrow. A man's hands, gentle but somehow weak. A child's laughter, pure and bright before the world had taught it to be afraid. These were not his memories, exactly, but they were connected to him in ways that made his chest tighten with emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. They were the memories of what could have been, the ghost images of a life that might have unfolded differently if different choices had been made at crucial moments. They were the memories of love, and they hurt in a way that no Cruciatus curse had ever managed to achieve. But Tom was not alone in this place. As he walked deeper into the impossible station, following the sound of that heartbreaking crying, he began to sense other presences moving through the mist. They were not quite solid, not quite real, but they were definitely there, watching, waiting. Some of them seemed familiar, though he could not yet place their faces. Others were completely unknown. But somehow he understood that they were all connected to him, all part of the great web of choices and consequences that had brought him to this moment. The first to materialize clearly was a figure he recognized immediately, though it had been decades since he had allowed himself to think about her. She was tall and elegant, with the kind of beauty that came not from perfection but from inner strength. Her robes were simple but well made, and her hair was pulled back in a style that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were exactly like his own, dark and intelligent and deep, but they held something his had never possessed: compassion. Professor Minerva McGonagall stood before him, not as she had been in life but as she existed in the realm of pure truth that surrounded them. Here, stripped of all pretense and social convention, she was revealed as what she had always been, a woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing the potential in others, even when that potential had been twisted and corrupted by forces beyond her control. "Tom," she said, and her voice carried the weight of all the conversations they had never had, all the guidance she had tried to offer that he had rejected, all the disappointment she had felt as she watched a brilliant student choose the path of darkness. "I wondered when you would finally come to understand." He wanted to respond with anger, with the cold disdain that had been his shield against any emotion that might make him vulnerable. But here, in this place where souls were laid bare, such defenses were useless. Instead, he found himself asking the question that had haunted him since childhood, though he had never allowed himself to voice it aloud. "Why did no one stop me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of decades of choices that could not be undone. McGonagall's expression softened, and for a moment she looked not like the stern professor he remembered, but like the woman she had been before the world had taught her to build walls around her heart. "We tried, Tom. We all tried. But the choice was always yours to make." The crying grew louder, more insistent, and Tom realized that it was coming from deeper within the station, from platforms that stretched beyond the limits of what his eyes could see. Other figures were beginning to emerge from the mist now, some more solid than others, all of them connected to him by threads of memory and consequence that glowed like silver in the strange light of this place. This was only the beginning. The real journey lay ahead, deeper into the station, closer to the source of that heartbreaking sound. And with each step, Tom Riddle would be forced to confront not just who he had become, but who he had been before the darkness claimed him, and who he might have been if he had chosen differently. The mist swirled around them, and McGonagall's form began to fade, but her words remained clear in the air. "The choice is still yours, Tom. It has always been yours." The acceptance of his quest came not as a moment of heroic decision, but as the slow, inevitable recognition of a truth that had been waiting for him his entire life. Tom Riddle understood, with a clarity that cut through him like ice, that this was not a place he could escape from through cunning or magic or force of will. This was the place where all masks fell away, where all deceptions crumbled, where the only path forward was through complete and total honesty with himself. The crying had not stopped. If anything, it had grown more persistent, more heartbreaking, as if the very act of being heard was causing whatever made that sound to hope for the first time in decades. Tom found himself walking toward it, not because he wanted to, but because he understood, on some fundamental level, that this was the only way out, through the pain, through the truth, through the confrontation with everything he had spent his life trying to avoid. The station around him began to shift and change as he walked, responding to his thoughts and memories in ways that defied all logic. The Victorian ironwork would suddenly bloom with roses, blood red and beautiful, before withering away to reveal the cold metal beneath. The platforms would stretch and contract like living things, leading his feet along paths that seemed to spiral inward toward some central truth that waited at the heart of everything. And everywhere, carved into the stone and metal, were names, not just any names, but the names of everyone he had ever killed, everyone he had ever hurt, everyone whose life he had touched with violence and fear. They glowed with a soft, accusatory light, and as he passed each one he could feel the weight of that life pressing down on him, demanding acknowledgement, demanding justice, demanding something he had never been able to give: genuine remorse. The first mythological hints began to appear as he walked deeper into the station. Ancient runes carved into the walls, not with magic but with something far older and more fundamental. They spoke of the nature of the soul, of the laws that governed life and death, of the prices that must be paid for the choices we make. Tom could read them, though he had never studied this particular form of writing. Here, in this place between worlds, understanding came not from knowledge but from simple recognition of universal truths. One inscription, carved in stone that seemed to pulse within a light, read, "The soul that is divided cannot find peace until it chooses to become whole." Another, etched in metal that sang with harmonics just beyond hearing, "Love is the only force that can heal what hatred has broken." And a third, written in what looked like starlight itself, "Every choice echoes through eternity, but every soul retains the power to choose again." As he read these words, Tom felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced since childhood. It was not quite hope, but it was something close to it, a sense that perhaps, even now, even after everything he had done, there might still be a path forward that did not end in the absolute darkness he had always assumed awaited him. The memory came suddenly, without warning, triggered by the sight of a particular platform that seemed to shimmer with golden light. He was 11 years old again, standing in this very station, but it was the real King's Cross this time. Not this impossible version. He was alone, as he had always been alone, with a single trunk and a heart full of desperate hope. Hogwarts was going to be different. Hogwarts was going to be the place where he finally found what he had been searching for his entire young life. A place to belong. People who would see his potential and nurture it. A family that would love him for who he was rather than fear him for what he could do. The boy Tom had been stood on that platform, looking up at the great glass ceiling with wonder in his eyes, imagining all the possibilities that lay ahead. He had dreams then, dreams that had nothing to do with darkness or domination or immortality. He had dreamed of becoming a great wizard. Yes, but great in the way that Dumbledore was great, respected and admired, and most importantly loved. He had dreamed of teaching, of passing on his knowledge to the next generation, of building something beautiful and lasting in the world. That boy had been real. That hope had been real, and somewhere, in the deepest part of his fractured soul, it still existed, buried beneath layers of fear and anger and the desperate need to prove that he was worth something, that he mattered, that he would not be forgotten. The crying grew louder, and Tom realized with a shock that ran through him like lightning that it was coming from that boy, the 11-year-old Tom Riddle, full of hope and dreams and the innocent belief that the world was fundamentally good, was somewhere in this station, weeping for everything he had lost, everything he had chosen to throw away in his pursuit of power and immortality. The quest was clear now. He had to find that boy, that lost part of himself, and somehow make peace with the choices that had led him so far from the light. But the path ahead was treacherous, filled with the ghosts of everyone he had wronged, everyone he had failed to love, everyone who had tried to save him from himself. Other figures were beginning to emerge from the mist more clearly now. Some he recognized, professors from Hogwarts, who had tried to guide him, fellow students who had offered friendship that he had rejected, even some of the people he had killed, who now looked at him not with hatred, but with something far more devastating: pity. The station stretched on endlessly in all directions, each platform leading to a different aspect of his life, a different choice point, a different moment when he could have chosen love instead of fear, connection instead of isolation, healing instead of destruction. The journey ahead would take him through all of it, every moment of pain and every missed opportunity, every act of cruelty and every chance for redemption that he had ignored. But first, he had to find the source of that crying. He had to find the boy who had once believed in magic, not as a tool for domination, but as a gift to be shared with the world. The boy who had once dreamed of being loved simply for who he was, not for what he could do, or what he could give, or what he could take away. The mist swirled around him, and Tom Riddle began to walk deeper into the station, following the sound of his own lost innocence weeping in the distance. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back now, only forward, into the heart of truth itself, where the final accounting of a life would be made, and where the possibility of redemption waited like a candle flame in the darkness, fragile but unextinguished. The deeper Tom ventured into the impossible station, the more the architecture began to reveal its secrets. What had initially appeared to be a simple if endless train platform was actually something far more complex and mysterious. The Victorian ironwork twisted and curved in patterns that seemed to follow no earthly logic, creating corridors and chambers that existed in dimensions his mind could barely process. It was as if the station itself was alive, breathing, responding to his presence by reshaping itself to show him exactly what he needed to see. The first major discovery came when he found himself standing before a great archway that had definitely not been there moments before. It was carved from what looked like black marble, but as he approached he could see that it was not stone at all, but something that pulsed with its own inner darkness. The archway was covered in symbols that made his eyes water to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he watched them, rearranging themselves into new patterns of meaning. But it was what lay beyond the archway that truly stopped him cold. Through the opening, he could see not another platform or corridor, but a vast library that stretched upward and outward beyond the limits of sight. The shelves were filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts that glowed with their own inner light. And as he stepped through the archway, he realized with a shock that he knew what this place was. This was the repository of souls, the mythical archive where the true history of every choice ever made was recorded and preserved. The air in the library was thick with the scent of ancient parchment, and something else, something that made his soul ache with recognition. It was the smell of missed opportunities, of paths not taken, of words unspoken and love unexpressed. Every book on these endless shelves represented a life, a soul, a complete record of every choice made and every consequence that followed. And somewhere in this vast collection was his own story, waiting to be read and understood in its entirety. Tom approached the nearest shelf with trembling hands, though he could not have said why he was trembling. The books seemed to call to him, their covers inscribed with names he recognized, people whose lives he had touched, whose stories had become entwined with his own. He reached for one at random, a slim volume bound in deep blue leather, and as his fingers touched the cover, the name appeared in silver letters, Myrtle Elizabeth Warren. The book fell open in his hands, and suddenly he was not in the library at all, but in the second-floor girls' bathroom at Hogwarts, watching as a young girl with thick glasses and a shy smile emerged from one of the stalls. She was humming to herself, a simple melody that spoke of innocent happiness. Unaware that she had only moments left to live, Tom watched, frozen as his younger self appeared in the reflection of the mirror, his face already twisted with the cold calculation that would define the rest of his existence. "Hello, Myrtle," his younger self said, and even now, decades later, Tom could hear the false kindness in his own voice, the practiced charm that had fooled so many people for so long. "I've been looking for you." The scene played out exactly as he remembered it, but now he experienced it from both perspectives simultaneously. He felt his younger self's excitement at finally having the chance to create his first Horcrux, the cold satisfaction of having solved the problem of mortality. But he also felt Myrtle's confusion, her momentary hope that perhaps this handsome older student had actually sought her out for friendship, and then her terror as she realized what was happening to her. The yellow eyes of the basilisk filled the mirror, and Myrtle's scream echoed through the bathroom and through time itself, a sound of pure terror and betrayal that would haunt Tom for the rest of his existence. But what he had not experienced the first time, what he was only now understanding, was the moment of her death itself. The precise instant when her life force left her body, when everything she had been, everything she might have become, was snuffed out forever. In that moment, he felt what she had felt. The crushing realization that her life was ending before it had really begun. The desperate desire to tell someone, anyone, that she had mattered, that she had been here, that she had loved and hoped and dreamed just like everyone else. The terrible loneliness of dying alone, killed by someone who saw her not as a person but as a necessary sacrifice to his own ambitions. The book snapped shut in his hands, and Tom found himself back in the library, gasping as if he had been underwater. But the lesson was clear now. This was not just a repository of facts and events. This was a place where the full emotional truth of every action was preserved, where the consequences of every choice rippled outward in ways that the living mind could never fully comprehend. The crying that had been his constant companion since arriving in this place grew louder, more insistent, and Tom realized that it was coming from deeper within the library, from sections that stretched beyond what his eyes could see. As he walked toward the sound, more books began to call to him, their covers glowing with names he recognized: James Potter, Lily Potter, Frank Longbottom, Alice Longbottom, and hundreds of others whose lives he had ended or destroyed. But there were other books too, books that puzzled him. They bore the names of people he had never killed, people he had barely known, yet they seemed to pulse with the same accusatory light as the rest. He pulled one from the shelf, a thick volume bound in green leather, and saw the name Severus Snape inscribed in silver script. As the book opened, Tom found himself standing in a moonlit graveyard, watching as his adult self performed the ritual that would restore his body. But this time, he was not experiencing it from his own perspective. Instead, he was seeing it through the eyes of the man kneeling beside the cauldron, the man whose trembling hands were performing the dark magic that would bring the Dark Lord back to life. Severus Snape was terrified, not just of the ritual itself, but of what it meant, of what he was helping to unleash upon the world. Tom could feel the young man's internal struggle, his desperate desire to find some way to protect the woman he loved, even as he participated in the very act that would ultimately lead to her death. The irony was devastating. Snape's love for Lily Potter had driven him to serve the man who would kill her, had made him an instrument of the very fate he was trying to prevent. The book closed and Tom staggered backward, overwhelmed by the complexity of the emotions he had just experienced. How many lives had he touched without ever truly seeing them? How many people had suffered because of choices he had made without ever considering the full consequences? The weight of it all was crushing, more painful than any physical torture he had ever endured. The crying grew louder still, and Tom realized with a shock that it was not coming from somewhere else in the library. It was coming from behind him, from a small alcove he had not noticed before. The space was barely large enough for a child to hide in, and as he approached he could see a figure huddled there, small and broken and utterly alone. It was a boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with dark hair and eyes that were red from crying. He was wearing clothes that were too big for him, hand-me-downs that had seen better days, and he was clutching something against his chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. As Tom knelt down to get a better look, he realized with a shock that the boy was him. Not his younger self from Hogwarts, but the very youngest version of himself, the child who had lived in the orphanage before he had learned to hide his feelings behind masks of charm and calculation. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were full of pain and confusion, and Tom saw reflected there all the hurt and fear and desperate need for love that he had spent his entire life trying to suppress. This was the source of the crying, the lost part of himself that had been weeping for over 60 years, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to offer the love and acceptance that had never come. In the boy's arms, clutched against his chest like a lifeline, was a small stuffed rabbit. It was worn and faded, clearly well loved, and Tom remembered it now with a clarity that made his chest tighten. It had been his only companion during those early years, the only thing that had offered him any comfort in the cold, lonely world of the orphanage. He had forgotten about it completely, had buried the memory so deeply that it had seemed to disappear entirely. But here it was, preserved in this place where all truths were kept, a reminder of the child he had been before the world had taught him that love was weakness, that caring was dangerous, that the only way to survive was to make others fear him more than he feared them. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held no hatred, no anger, only a desperate question. Why didn't anyone love me? And Tom realized, with a clarity that cut through him like a blade, that this was the question that had driven everything else. Every act of cruelty, every choice toward darkness, every step away from the light had been motivated by this single, fundamental wound. The belief that he was unlovable, that there was something fundamentally wrong with him, that made him unworthy of the care and affection that other children seemed to receive so easily. The first open loop was now clear. The crying child was not just a memory or a metaphor. It was the core of his being. The part of him that had been damaged so early and so thoroughly that everything else had grown around it, like scar tissue. To heal, to find any hope of redemption, he would have to find a way to comfort this child, to answer this question, to somehow provide the love that had been missing from the very beginning. But how do you love a child who has grown up to become a monster? How do you heal a wound that has been festering for over 60 years? How do you find compassion for someone who has shown none to others? The boy continued to cry, and Tom knelt there in the alcove, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task before him. The library stretched on endlessly around them, filled with the records of every choice, every consequence, every missed opportunity for love and connection. And somewhere in all of that vast collection of human experience was the answer he needed, the key to healing the deepest wound of all. The crying echoed through the repository of souls, and Tom Riddle began to understand that his journey was just beginning. The real mystery was not what he had seen when he died, but what he was going to choose to do about it now that he finally understood the truth about himself and the pain that had driven him to such darkness. The boy in the alcove looked up at him with eyes that held the faintest glimmer of hope, and Tom realized that for the first time in his life, he was being given a chance to choose love over fear, healing over hatred, connection over isolation. The question was whether he would have the courage to take it. Tom stared at the crying child in the alcove, and his first instinct was the same one that had served him throughout his life. To find a rational explanation that would allow him to maintain control over the situation. This place, this impossible library with its endless shelves of human experience, this child who claimed to be his younger self, it was all simply the dying hallucinations of a brain starved of oxygen, the neural pathways firing their last desperate signals before complete shutdown, creating elaborate fantasies to cushion the blow of final extinction. The explanation felt comfortable, familiar. It was the kind of logical analysis that had always been his strength, the ability to see through illusion and deception to the cold facts beneath. Magic was real, yes, but it followed rules and principles that could be understood and manipulated. What he was experiencing now was simply his mind's way of processing the trauma of death, creating symbolic representations of guilt and regret that would fade as soon as his brain activity ceased completely. "You're not real," he said to the child, his voice carrying the same authority he had used to command Death Eaters and strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. "None of this is real. I'm dying, and my mind is creating elaborate fantasies to distract me from that fact." The boy looked up at him with those impossibly sad eyes, still clutching the worn stuffed rabbit against his chest. For a moment, Tom thought the child might disappear, might fade away like a proper hallucination should when confronted with logic and disbelief. But instead, the boy simply tilted his head slightly, as if confused by the very concept of not being real. "But I hurt," the child said simply. "How can something that's not real hurt this much?" Tom pushed the question aside. Pain was just another neurological function, another electrical impulse traveling along nerve pathways that were shutting down one by one. The fact that his dying brain was creating the sensation of emotional pain to accompany its visual hallucinations was actually quite clever. A final trick of evolution to make the process of death seem meaningful rather than arbitrary. He stood up from the alcove, turning away from the child with the same cold dismissal he had shown to countless pleas for mercy over the years. The library around him continued to pulse with that strange inner light, the books on their endless shelves seeming to whisper and murmur as he passed, but he ignored them all. Hallucinations could be incredibly detailed, incredibly convincing, but they were still just electrical impulses firing in patterns that created the illusion of experience. The crying continued behind him, but he had learned long ago to shut out sounds that served no useful purpose. He had more important things to focus on, like finding a way out of this dying dream and back to consciousness. There had to be a way to reverse the process, to pull his consciousness back from the brink of extinction. He was Lord Voldemort, after all. He had conquered death before through the creation of Horcruxes, had found ways to exist beyond the normal limitations of mortality. Surely he could find a way to survive this as well. As he walked through the library, Tom began to notice inconsistencies that supported his theory about hallucinations. The architecture would shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at it, walls moving and reshaping themselves in ways that defied the laws of physics. The books would rearrange themselves on the shelves, new titles appearing while others vanished entirely. The very air seemed to shimmer and flow like water, carrying scents and sounds that belonged to different times and places entirely. These were classic signs of a mind that was losing its grip on rational thought, creating a dream world that borrowed elements from memory and imagination without regard for consistency or logic. The fact that he could recognize these inconsistencies was actually reassuring, proof that his rational mind was still functioning even as the rest of his consciousness began to shut down. But then he saw her, and all his careful rationalization began to crumble. She was standing at the end of one of the library's long aisles, exactly as he remembered her from the single photograph he had managed to find years ago. Mira P. Gaunt was not beautiful in any conventional sense, her features too sharp, her posture too hunched, her clothes too shabby and worn. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Tom's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with dying neural pathways or hallucinated emotions. Love. Pure, desperate, overwhelming love. The kind that asked for nothing in return and gave everything without reservation. It was the look a mother should have for her child, the expression that should have been the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes in the world. It was what had been missing from his entire life, the absence that had shaped everything he had become. "My son," she said, and her voice was exactly as he had always imagined it would be, soft and gentle and full of the warmth that had never been there to comfort him during those long, cold nights in the orphanage. "My beautiful boy, I've been waiting for you." Tom wanted to maintain his skeptical distance, to treat this apparition with the same cold analysis he had applied to everything else in this strange place. But something in her presence bypassed all his rational defenses and went straight to the wounded core of his being, the part of him that had spent 70 years wondering why his mother had chosen to die rather than live for him. "You're not real," he said. But his voice lacked conviction now, sounded almost plaintive, rather than authoritative. "My mother died when I was born. She chose death over love, chose to abandon me rather than fight to stay alive." Merope's expression didn't change, didn't show anger or hurt at his accusation. Instead, she simply looked at him with that same overwhelming love, as if nothing he could say or do would ever diminish it even slightly. "I never abandoned you, Tom," she said gently. "I never had the chance to love you the way you deserved to be loved. But that doesn't mean the love wasn't there. It doesn't mean it isn't still there." The library around him began to shimmer and change, the books on the shelves rearranging themselves into new patterns that seemed to pulse with soft golden light. The air itself seemed to warm, carrying scents that spoke of home and safety and unconditional acceptance. And somewhere in the distance, the crying of the child in the alcove began to soften, as if the presence of this woman was offering comfort that had been missing for over 60 years. Tom felt his careful rationalization beginning to slip away, replaced by something far more dangerous: hope. The possibility that this place was real, that these people were real, that there might actually be something beyond death other than the cold extinction he had always feared. The possibility that love might actually exist, might actually be powerful enough to reach across the barriers of time and death to offer healing to even the most damaged soul. But hope was dangerous. Hope was what had made him vulnerable as a child, what had led to disappointment and pain and the eventual decision to never trust anyone or anything again. Hope was the enemy of the cold, calculating control that had kept him alive and powerful for 70 years. "This is still just a hallucination," he said. But even as he spoke the words, he could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, a dying brain's attempt to create meaning where none exists. Merope smiled, and it was the smile he had imagined 1,000 times during his childhood, the expression of maternal love that he had craved more than food or warmth or safety. "Does it matter if it's real or not, Tom? Does it change what you feel right now, seeing me here, hearing me tell you that you were loved from the moment you were conceived?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Tom wasn't ready to face. Because if this was real, if love was real, if there really was something beyond death that offered the possibility of connection and healing, then everything he had believed about the nature of existence was wrong. Everything he had done, every choice he had made, every person he had hurt or killed in his pursuit of power and immortality, all of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what life was actually about. The crying in the distance grew softer still, and Tom realized that his presence here, his willingness to even consider the possibility that love might be real, was having an effect on that wounded child in the alcove. The boy who had been weeping for over 60 years was beginning to quiet, beginning to hope that perhaps someone might finally answer his desperate question about why no one had ever loved him. But Tom wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't ready to give up the cold certainty that had been his armor against the world for so long. The explanation of hallucination was still there, still available, still offering the comfort of familiar cynicism over the terrifying vulnerability of hope. The library continued to pulse with golden light around them, and Merope continued to look at him with that expression of unlimited love, waiting patiently for him to make a choice about what he was willing to believe, what he was willing to risk, what he was willing to hope for in this strange place between life and death. The first false conclusion was beginning to crumble, but Tom clung to it anyway, afraid of what he might find if he let it go completely. The deeper Tom ventured into the repository of souls, the more the boundaries between memory and reality began to blur in ways that made his rational explanations feel increasingly inadequate. The library had given way to something even more impossible, a vast network of chambers and corridors that seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, reshaping themselves according to some logic that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with the landscape of human experience. One moment he would find himself walking through what appeared to be the corridors of Hogwarts as they had been during his student years, the torches casting dancing shadows on stone walls that held the echo of 1,000 conversations. The next, he would step through a doorway and emerge into the parlor of the Gaunt family hovel, with its atmosphere of decayed gentility and barely contained madness. Then another step would take him into the orphanage dormitory, where he had spent his earliest years, with its rows of identical beds and the pervasive smell of carbolic soap and institutional despair. But these were not simple memories being replayed. They were something far more complex and mysterious, spaces that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, showing him not just what had happened, but what could have happened if different choices had been made at crucial moments. In the Hogwarts corridors he could see ghostly figures of himself walking alongside spectral companions, friends he might have made if he had been willing to trust, relationships he might have built if he had chosen connection over domination. In one particularly vivid scene, he watched as a translucent version of his teenage self sat in the common room with a group of other Slytherin students, but instead of the calculating manipulation that had characterized his actual relationships, this phantom Tom was simply talking and laughing with genuine warmth. The conversation was about magical theory, about the excitement of discovery and learning, about dreams for the future that had nothing to do with power or control or immortality. "Can you imagine?" the ghostly Tom was saying, his face animated with an enthusiasm that the real Tom had forgotten he had ever possessed. "What we could accomplish if we really worked together, if we pooled our knowledge and talents instead of competing against each other all the time." One of his companions, a girl with kind eyes and an infectious smile, leaned forward eagerly. "I've been thinking the same thing, Tom. There's so much we could discover, so many problems we could solve. Magic isn't meant to be hoarded or used for personal gain. It's meant to be shared, to make the world better for everyone." The real Tom watched this scene with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. This version of himself felt authentic in a way that disturbed him deeply. It wasn't a fantasy or a wish fulfillment, but a glimpse of what he might have become if the fundamental wound of abandonment hadn't driven him to seek power as a substitute for love. This phantom Tom was still brilliant, still ambitious, still destined for greatness, but his greatness was built on connection rather than isolation, on lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The scene shifted, and suddenly he was standing in a version of the Chamber of Secrets that had never known violence or death. Instead of a place of horror, it had been transformed into a sanctuary of learning, where students came to study the most advanced magical theories in an atmosphere of safety and mutual respect. The great statue of Salazar Slytherin still dominated the space, but its expression was not one of cold arrogance but of benevolent wisdom, a teacher watching over his students with pride rather than judgment. And there, at the center of it all, was another phantom version of himself. But this one was older, perhaps in his 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter rather than cruelty. He was teaching a small group of advanced students, guiding them through complex spell work with patience and genuine care for their development. "Remember," this older phantom Tom was saying, "magic responds to intention as much as technique. If your heart isn't in harmony with your spell, if you're casting from a place of fear or anger or selfish desire, the magic will reflect that back to you. The most powerful spells are always cast from a place of love, whether it's love for the person you're trying to help, love for the knowledge you're trying to uncover, or simply love for magic itself." One of the students, a nervous young woman who reminded Tom painfully of Myrtle Warren, raised her hand tentatively. "But Professor Riddle, what if you don't know how to love? What if you've never experienced it properly?" The phantom Tom's expression softened with compassion, and he knelt down beside her desk so that he could look into her eyes at her level. "Then you start small," he said gently. "You find one tiny thing in the world that brings you joy, something as simple as the way sunlight looks when it hits the surface of the lake, or the sound of rain on the windows, or the feeling of a book opening in your hands when you're about to discover something new. You hold on to that feeling, you nurture it, you let it grow. Love isn't something you either have or don't have, it's something you cultivate, like a garden." Tom watched this scene with a growing sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the shifting architecture around him. This version of himself was not just different in terms of career or relationships. He was fundamentally transformed at the level of character, at the level of soul. This was who Tom Riddle might have become if he had chosen healing over harm, if he had sought to mend the wound of abandonment through connection rather than through the accumulation of power over others. The peaceful interlude that followed was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire experience. He found himself in a garden that existed nowhere in his actual memories, but felt more real than any place he had ever been. It was twilight, with stars beginning to appear in a sky that seemed to stretch infinitely upward. The air was warm and gentle, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers and the distant sound of water flowing over stones. Sitting on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree was the child from the alcove, but he was no longer crying. Instead, he was simply sitting quietly, still holding his worn stuffed rabbit, but now his face was calm and peaceful. The desperate sadness was still there in his eyes, but it was overlaid with something else now, the quiet hope that perhaps, eventually someone might answer his question about love. Tom approached the bench slowly, unsure of what he was supposed to do or say. The child looked up at him with those familiar dark eyes, and for the first time there was no accusation in his gaze, no desperate pleading, just a simple recognition, one soul acknowledging another, across the vast distance of years and choices and consequences. "Are you going to sit with me?" the child asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom found himself sitting on the bench before he had consciously decided to do so, maintaining a careful distance from the boy but close enough to feel the warmth of another presence. They sat in comfortable silence for what felt like hours, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, listening to the gentle sounds of the impossible garden around them. "I saw you," the child said eventually. "In those other places, the person you could have been." "Those weren't real," Tom replied automatically, but the words felt hollow even to himself. "They felt real," the child said simply. "They felt like home." The second open loop was beginning to reveal itself now, though Tom was not yet ready to fully acknowledge what it meant. The question was not just about his own capacity for love and redemption, but about the nature of choice itself. If these phantom versions of himself were real in some sense, if they represented genuine possibilities that had existed at various points in his life, then what did that say about the choices he had actually made? What did it say about the person he had become? More importantly, what did it say about the choice that might still be available to him now, in this strange place between life and death, where the normal rules of time and consequence seemed to bend and flex in ways that defied understanding? The child reached out tentatively and touched Tom's hand with fingers that felt surprisingly solid and warm. The contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with simple human connection, the kind of basic comfort that he had been denied as a child and had spent his entire life telling himself he didn't need. "I've been waiting for you," the child said softly. "For so long, I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me completely." Tom looked down at the small hand touching his own, and for the first time in over 60 years, he allowed himself to imagine what it might have been like to receive comfort when he needed it most. To have someone sit with him in his pain instead of leaving him to face it alone. The phantom versions of himself that he had seen, the teacher and the friend and the healer, they all began with this moment, with the simple choice to acknowledge the wounded child within and offer him the love that had been missing from the very beginning. But that would mean admitting that love was real, that connection was possible, that the cold isolation he had built his entire identity around was not the truth of existence, but simply one choice among many. It would mean acknowledging that he had been wrong about almost everything that mattered, that the power and fear and domination he had pursued so relentlessly were poor substitutes for the very thing he had convinced himself didn't exist. The garden continued to pulse with gentle starlight around them, and the child continued to hold his hand with infinite patience, waiting for him to make a choice about what he was willing to believe, what he was willing to hope for, what he was willing to risk in this impossible place where souls came to understand themselves completely. The crying had stopped entirely now, replaced by a peaceful silence that felt like the first moment of rest Tom had experienced in over 70 years. But he knew that this peace was fragile, dependent on choices he had not yet made, questions he had not yet answered, truths he had not yet been willing to face. The deeper exploration was only beginning, and already he could sense that the easy explanations were crumbling. leaving him face to face with possibilities that were both more wonderful and more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. Time moved differently in the space between worlds, flowing in spirals and eddies that carried echoes of choices made centuries ago by souls who had faced similar crossroads. As Tom sat in the impossible garden with the child who was his younger self, the air around them began to shimmer with something that was not quite memory and not quite vision, but something far more profound, the accumulated wisdom of every dark wizard who had ever stood at the threshold between life and death and been forced to confront the true nature of their choices. The first echo came as a whisper on the night wind, carrying with it the scent of sulfur and the bitter taste of regret. A figure materialized in the starlight, tall and imposing even in his translucent state, wearing robes that had once been magnificent but now hung in tatters around a form that flickered between human and something far more terrible. Tom recognized him immediately from the ancient texts he had studied in his quest for immortality. Herpo the Foul, the first wizard ever to successfully create a Horcrux. But this was not the triumphant conqueror of death that the histories described. This was a soul in torment, bearing the weight of millennia spent in a liminal space between existence and extinction. Neither fully alive nor properly dead, his eyes, when they turned to meet Tom's gaze, were wells of infinite sadness that spoke of wisdom gained too late to matter. "So young," Herpo said, his voice carrying the accumulated weariness of 2,000 years. "So very young, and yet so eager to repeat my mistakes. Did you never wonder in all your research into the nature of Horcruxes what became of their creator? Did you never think to ask what the price truly was?" Tom wanted to respond with his usual arrogance, to assert his superiority over this ancient wizard who had clearly failed where Tom had succeeded. But something in Herpo's presence commanded a respect that went beyond mere magical power. This was a soul that had traveled the path Tom was only beginning to explore, and the accumulated weight of his experience was undeniable. "I succeeded where you failed," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I achieved true immortality. I conquered death itself." Herpo's laugh was like autumn leaves crumbling to dust. "Did you? Look around you, young one. Where are your Horcruxes now? Where is the body you fought so hard to preserve? You stand here, in this place between worlds, exactly as I have stood for 20 centuries. The only difference is that I have had time to understand what we truly accomplished with our great magic." The garden around them began to shift and change, the peaceful starlight replaced by something colder and more harsh. Tom found himself standing in what appeared to be an ancient Greek temple, but one that had been corrupted by dark magic until the very stones seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, arrangements of lines and curves that spoke of fundamental violations of the natural order. "This was my sanctuary," Herpo continued, gesturing toward the twisted architecture around them. "The place where I first split my soul, where I first thought I had achieved the greatest victory in the history of magic. I was so proud, so certain that I had found the secret that had eluded every wizard before me. I would live forever. I would accumulate knowledge and power beyond imagining. I would become as a god among mortals." The child beside Tom had grown very quiet, his small hand still clasped in Tom's own. But now Tom could feel the boy trembling slightly. Not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. This place, this twisted temple with its atmosphere of spiritual corruption, felt familiar in a way that made Tom's chest tighten with something that might have been shame. "But immortality," Herpo continued, his form flickering as if the very act of remembering was painful, "is not the gift I thought it would be. Do you know what happens to a soul that has been fractured, young one? Do you understand what it means to exist without the capacity for true connection, true love, true peace?" More figures began to materialize around them, other dark wizards from throughout history who had walked similar paths and faced similar choices. Tom recognized some of them from his studies. Echrisdes, who had created Azkaban as a monument to his own twisted genius. Morgan Le Fay, whose pursuit of power had ultimately consumed everything she had claimed to love. Gellert Grindelwald, whose dreams of a greater good had been built on a foundation of hatred and fear. But like Herpo, none of them appeared as the triumphant conquerors that history remembered. Instead, they were revealed as they truly were, souls in torment, bearing the weight of choices that had seemed so logical, so necessary, so justified at the time, but which had ultimately led them into a darkness from which there was no easy escape. "We all thought we were different," said a figure that Tom slowly recognized as Echrisdes, his voice carrying the echo of centuries spent in isolation. "We all believed that our cause was righteous, our methods necessary, our goals worthy of any sacrifice. We told ourselves that love was weakness, that compassion was foolishness, that the only truth that mattered was power. And we were all wrong," added Morgan Le Fay, her once beautiful face now bearing the marks of spiritual corruption that no amount of magic could heal. "We gained everything we thought we wanted, and in doing so we lost everything that actually mattered." Tom felt the child's hand tighten in his own, and he realized that the boy was not trembling with fear, but with recognition. This was what he had been trying to warn against all along. This was the fate that awaited anyone who chose the path of darkness. Not the glorious immortality that Tom had imagined, but an existence cut off from everything that made life worth living, trapped in a liminal space between being and nothingness, with only regret for company. "But there is another way," said a new voice, and Tom turned to see a figure that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Unlike the dark wizards who surrounded them, this soul radiated peace and contentment, a sense of completion that was almost painful to witness after so much spiritual darkness. Tom didn't recognize the figure, but the child beside him seemed to know immediately who it was. "Merlin," the boy whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe that Tom had thought himself incapable of feeling. "Not the Merlin of legend," the glowing figure said gently, "but simply a soul who chose differently when faced with the same crossroads you face now. A wizard who discovered that true power comes not from dominating others, but from serving them, not from accumulating magical knowledge for its own sake, but from using that knowledge to heal and protect and nurture." The temple around them began to transform again, the twisted symbols on the walls fading away to be replaced by something entirely different. Now they stood in a place that felt like the opposite of everything Tom had built his life around. A space that radiated love and acceptance and the kind of peace that came from souls who had found their true purpose. "The choice is always the same," Merlin continued, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through lifetimes of service to others. "At every moment, in every decision, we choose between love and fear, between connection and isolation, between healing and harm. The dark wizards you see here all made the same fundamental error. They believed that their pain gave them the right to cause pain to others, that their wounds justified wounding the world." Tom looked around at the assembled souls, both dark and light, and began to understand what he was being shown. This was not just a history lesson about the choices made by wizards in the past. This was a revelation about the nature of choice itself, about the fundamental decision that every soul had to make about how to respond to the inevitable pain and disappointment of existence. The cultural exploration deepened as more figures appeared, representing not just individual wizards but entire traditions of magical thought and practice. Tom saw representatives of ancient Celtic Druidism, with their deep connection to the natural world and their understanding of magic as a force that flowed through all living things. He saw Egyptian priests who had mastered the arts of healing and protection, who had seen magic as a sacred trust that came with the responsibility to serve the greater good. In every culture, in every tradition, the same truth emerges, explained one of the Celtic druids, her voice carrying the rhythm of wind through ancient forests. "Magic is not meant to be hoarded or used for personal gain. It is a gift that flows through us, not from us. When we try to possess it, to control it, to use it to elevate ourselves above others, we violate the very nature of what magic is. The symbolic discoveries came thick and fast now, each one adding another layer to Tom's understanding of the choice he faced. The temple itself was revealed to be a representation of the soul, showing how the pursuit of dark magic corrupted not just the wizard's relationship with others, but their relationship with the very source of magical power itself. The twisted symbols on the walls were not just decorations, but actual wounds in the fabric of reality, places where the natural order had been violated by the selfish pursuit of individual power. "But the wounds can be healed," said the Egyptian priest, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent lifetimes learning the arts of restoration and renewal. "No soul is beyond redemption. No choice is so final that it cannot be redeemed by a greater choice made with full knowledge of the consequences." Tom felt his growing awareness like a physical weight in his chest, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. Everything he had believed about the nature of existence, everything he had built his identity around, was being systematically dismantled by the accumulated wisdom of souls who had walked this path before him. The cold certainty that had been his armor against the world was cracking, revealing the wounded child beneath who had never stopped hoping that love might be real after all. The child beside him seemed to sense his internal struggle, and for the first time since Tom had found him in the alcove, the boy spoke directly to him rather than simply existing in his presence. "They're showing us the truth," the child said softly. "All of them. The dark ones and the light ones. They're showing us that the choice is still ours to make. That even now, even after everything we've done, we can still choose differently." The ancient echoes continued to swirl around them, carrying the weight of millennia of choices and consequences, wisdom and regret, darkness and light. And at the center of it all was the fundamental question that every soul had to answer. When faced with pain, would you choose to heal or to harm? When confronted with your own wounds, would you seek to wound others in return? Or would you find the courage to break the cycle and choose love instead? The answer to that question would determine not just Tom's fate in this strange place between worlds, but the very nature of what his existence would become for whatever eternity awaited him beyond the threshold of death. The ancient echoes whispered their wisdom on the night wind, and Tom Riddle stood at the crossroads of choice, with the wounded child of his past looking up at him with infinite hope and infinite patience, waiting to see what he would decide. The assembled souls began to fade back into the ethereal mist, their ancient wisdom echoing in the air like the last notes of a symphony. But as they departed, one figure remained, becoming more solid and substantial with each passing moment. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the woman who had appeared briefly in the library, but now she stood before him with a clarity and presence that made denial impossible. Miracle Gaunt was exactly as he had imagined her in his darkest moments of childhood longing, but also completely different from the broken, defeated figure he had constructed in his mind. Yes, she bore the marks of hardship and sorrow, the unmistakable signs of a life lived in poverty and desperation. But there was something else there too, something that shone through the weariness, like starlight through storm clouds. An inexhaustible capacity for love that had survived every cruelty the world had inflicted upon her. She approached slowly, her movements careful and gentle, as if she were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. Her eyes never left Tom's face, and in their depths he could see a reflection of himself that was both devastating and transformative. She saw him not as the Dark Lord who had terrorized the wizarding world for decades, not as the monster who had split his soul and murdered countless innocents, but as the baby she had held for those precious few hours before her death. The child she had loved with every fiber of her being, despite knowing she would never have the chance to raise him. "My son," she said, and her voice carried the accumulated weight of 17 years of unspoken words, of lullabies never sung, of bedtime stories never told, of comfort never offered during the long, lonely nights of his childhood. "My beautiful, brilliant, wounded son, Tom wanted to retreat into the cold distance that had always been his refuge, to treat this apparition with the same dismissive arrogance he had shown to everyone who had ever tried to reach him. But something in her presence stripped away all his carefully constructed defenses, leaving him as vulnerable as the child who sat beside him on the garden bench. "You chose to die," he said, and his voice cracked like an adolescent's, carrying all the pain and accusation of a lifetime spent believing himself unwanted. "You could have lived, could have fought to stay with me, but you chose death instead. You chose to abandon me before I even had a chance to know you." Merope's expression didn't change, didn't show the hurt or anger that Tom had expected. Instead, she simply looked at him with that same overwhelming love, as if nothing he could say would ever diminish it, even slightly. "Oh, my darling boy," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that felt startlingly real and warm. "Is that what you've believed all these years? That I chose to leave you?" The touch of her hand against his cheek sent shockwaves through Tom's entire being. It was the first maternal contact he had ever experienced, the physical manifestation of a love that had existed all his life, but had never been able to reach him. For a moment he was not the feared Dark Lord, but simply a child who had spent 70 years wondering why his mother hadn't loved him enough to live. "I was 17 years old," Merope continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. 17, and already broken by years of abuse from my father and brother. When I used that love potion on Tom Riddle Sr., I thought I was claiming my own happiness for the first time in my life. But when I stopped giving it to him, when I hoped that perhaps he had learned to love me for myself, he abandoned me immediately, left me pregnant and alone in London with no money, no family, no magic to speak of, and no idea how to survive in the world. Tom felt something cracking inside his chest, some fundamental assumption about the nature of his origins that was being systematically dismantled by the simple truth of his mother's words. "I didn't choose to die, Tom," she said, her hand still cupping his cheek with infinite tenderness. "I fought to live. I fought harder than I had ever fought for anything. Because I knew that you were depending on me, I sold everything I had, even my father's locket, just to buy enough food to keep us both alive. I worked when I could find work, begged when I couldn't, slept in doorways and under bridges because I had nowhere else to go." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. The locket, Salazar Slytherin's locket, one of his precious Horcruxes, had been sold by his dying mother to buy food for her unborn child. The symbol of his heritage, his claim to greatness, had been sacrificed without a second thought because her love for him was more important than any material possession, no matter how precious or historically significant. "But I was too weak," Merope continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "My body couldn't take the strain of pregnancy combined with malnutrition and exposure to the elements. I knew I was dying, knew that I wouldn't survive your birth, but I held on as long as I could, because every day I carried you was another day I could love you, another day we could be together." Tom's world was rewriting itself around him, all his carefully constructed mythology about his origins crumbling in the face of this simple, devastating truth. His mother hadn't abandoned him. She had sacrificed everything, including her own life, in a desperate attempt to bring him safely into the world. The absence he had felt his entire life, the wound that had driven him to seek power and immortality, had not been caused by a lack of love, but by the tragic loss of a love so profound that it had literally consumed the person who felt it. "When I went into labor," she continued, "I used the last of my magic, every scrap of power I had left, to ensure that you would survive even if I didn't. I poured everything I was, everything I had ever been or ever could be, into keeping you alive. That's why I died the moment you were born, Tom. Not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you so completely that I gave you my very life force to ensure your survival." The child beside Tom had grown very still, his dark eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been healing. This was the answer to his question, the truth he had been seeking for over 60 years. He had been loved completely and unconditionally from the moment of his conception. The absence in his life had not been caused by a lack of love, but by the ultimate expression of it, a mother's sacrifice to ensure her child's survival. "But why couldn't I feel it?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did I grow up so empty, so cold? If you loved me so much, why was there nothing left for me to hold on to?" Merope's smile was both heartbreaking and beautiful, filled with the accumulated sorrow of a lifetime spent apart from the child she had died to protect. "Because love needs to be nurtured to survive, my darling. It needs to be reflected back, acknowledged, celebrated. The love I poured into you at the moment of your birth was real, but it was like a seed planted in ground that received no water, no sunlight, no care. It went dormant, but it never died. It's been waiting inside you all this time, waiting for someone to acknowledge it, to help it grow." Tom looked down at the child beside him, and for the first time he saw not a source of weakness or shame but a repository of incredible strength. This boy, this wounded, crying child who had lived inside him all these years, was not evidence of his failure to be loved, but proof of his capacity to love in return. The very fact that he had preserved this part of himself, had kept it alive despite decades of cruelty and isolation, was testimony to the power of his mother's sacrifice. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Tom asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning about himself and his origins. "How does knowing this change anything? The people I've killed are still dead. The pain I've caused is still real. How does discovering that I was loved make any of that better?" Merope's expression grew serious, but her love never wavered. "It doesn't change what you've done, Tom. Nothing can undo the choices you've made or bring back the lives you've taken. But it changes everything about what you can choose to do next. It changes everything about who you are at the deepest level of your being." She gestured toward the child, who was looking up at both of them with an expression of growing hope. "This part of yourself, this capacity for love that you've carried all these years, it's still real, it's still alive. You can choose to nurture it, to let it grow to become the foundation for something entirely new. You can choose to honor my sacrifice not by continuing to hurt others, but by finding ways to heal the wounds you've caused." The moral complexity of what she was suggesting was staggering. How could someone who had committed such terrible acts ever hope to find redemption? How could the love of a mother who had died 70 years ago possibly be strong enough to overcome the accumulated darkness of a lifetime spent in service to evil? But as Tom looked into Merope's eyes, he saw reflected there not judgment or condemnation, but infinite possibility. She saw him not as he was, but as he could become, not as the monster he had made himself, but as the man he had always had the potential to be. Her love was not contingent on his worthiness or dependent on his past choices. It simply was, as fundamental and unchanging as the laws of magic themselves. The child reached out and took Tom's other hand, and suddenly he was connected to both his past and his potential future, held in a circle of love that felt strong enough to withstand any amount of darkness or regret. For the first time in his life, Tom Riddle began to understand what it might mean to be truly home, to be held and accepted and cherished, not for what he could do or what he could give, but simply for who he was beneath all the masks and defenses and carefully constructed personas. "The choice is yours, my son," Merope said softly. "It has always been yours, but now you know that whatever you choose, you are choosing from a place of love, rather than from a place of emptiness. You are not the abandoned child you believed yourself to be. You are my beloved son, and you always have been." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would reshape everything Tom thought he knew about himself and his place in the universe. The relationship dynamics of his entire existence were being rewritten in real time, forced to accommodate this new understanding of the love that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged and embraced. As Tom sat in the impossible garden with his mother's hand on his face and his younger self's hand in his own, he began to understand that the journey he was on was not just about discovering what he had seen when he died, but about discovering what he might become if he chose to live differently. Even in this strange space between worlds where the normal rules of existence seemed to bend and flow like water, the question was no longer whether love was real, but whether he had the courage to accept it, to let it change him, to become the person his mother had seen when she looked at him in those final moments before her death. The choice was his, as it had always been, but now he would be choosing from a place of knowledge rather than ignorance, from a foundation of love rather than a void of abandonment. The garden continued to pulse with gentle starlight around them, and Tom Riddle sat at the crossroads of possibility, held in the embrace of a love that had waited 70 years to finally reach him. The moment Tom accepted the reality of his mother's love, the garden around them began to transform in ways that defied not just physical laws but the very nature of perception itself. The gentle starlight that had bathed everything in peaceful silver suddenly blazed with the intensity of 1,000 suns, but instead of burning or blinding, it revealed truths that had been hidden in the shadows of Tom's consciousness for his entire existence. He was no longer sitting on a bench in an impossible garden. Instead, he found himself standing in the center of what could only be described as the heart of all existence, a space where every choice ever made by every soul who had ever lived existed simultaneously in a vast, interconnected web of cause and effect. The web stretched infinitely in all directions, pulsing with threads of light that connected every action to its consequences, every moment of kindness to the joy it created, every act of cruelty to the ripples of pain that spread outward like shock waves through the fabric of reality. And there at the center of this impossible tapestry, Tom could see his own life laid out in its entirety. Not just the events he remembered, but the events he had forgotten, the moments he had dismissed as unimportant, the countless tiny choices that had accumulated over the decades to create the man he had become. But more than that, he could see the lives of everyone he had ever touched, everyone who had been affected by his choices, everyone who had suffered because of his actions. The vision was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its clarity. He saw Myrtle Warren not just in the moment of her death, but in all the moments that death had stolen from her. He saw the woman she might have become, the husband she might have married, the children she might have raised, the discoveries she might have made, the lives she might have touched with kindness and compassion. Her death had created a void in the tapestry of existence, a dark space where light and love and laughter should have been. But Myrtle was only the beginning. The web showed him every life he had taken, every dream he had destroyed, every possibility he had erased from existence. James and Lily Potter, cut down in the prime of their lives, while trying to protect their infant son. Frank and Alice Longbottom, tortured into madness and robbed of the chance to raise their child or contribute their talents to the world. Countless others, wizards and witches, and even muggles who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong place at the wrong time when Tom's path crossed theirs. Each death was not just an ending, but an entire universe of possibilities snuffed out forever. Each act of cruelty created ripples that spread outward, affecting not just the immediate victim, but everyone who had loved them, everyone who had depended on them, everyone whose life would have been touched by their continued existence. The weight of it all should have crushed him, should have driven him to his knees in despair. But something strange was happening. As he absorbed the full magnitude of his crimes, the threads of pain and loss and destruction that emanated from his choices were being met by other threads of light and hope and love that seemed to flow from an inexhaustible source somewhere beyond the edge of his perception. "Do you see?" asked a familiar voice, and Tom turned to find Dumbledore standing beside him, but not the Dumbledore he remembered from life. This was Dumbledore as he truly was, stripped of all pretense and political necessity, revealed as what he had always been at his core, a soul dedicated to the principle that love was the most powerful force in the universe. more powerful than any magic, more enduring than any empire, more transformative than any amount of accumulated knowledge or skill. I see the destruction I've caused, Tom replied, his voice hollow with the weight of accumulated guilt. I see the lives I've ruined, the dreams I've shattered, the light I've extinguished from the world. How is that supposed to help me understand anything other than the magnitude of my failures? Dumbledore smiled, and it was the same warm, grandfatherly expression Tom remembered from their encounters in life, but now it carried an additional weight of understanding that came from having seen the complete picture of existence. Look closer, Tom, he said gently. Look not just at the darkness you created, but at the light that responded to it. Tom focused his attention more carefully on the web of existence, and gradually he began to see what Dumbledore was pointing toward. For every thread of darkness that flowed from his choices, there were dozens of threads of light that had been created in response. Every act of cruelty had inspired someone somewhere to choose compassion. Every moment of hatred had prompted someone else to choose love more fiercely. Every life he had taken had motivated others to fight harder to protect the lives they could save. Harry Potter was the most obvious example. A boy who had channeled the trauma of losing his parents into an unwavering commitment to protecting others. But Harry was far from alone. Neville Longbottom had transformed the pain of his parents' torture into the courage to stand up to bullies and protect the vulnerable. The members of the Order of the Phoenix had seen the darkness Tom represented and chosen to dedicate their lives to fighting it, creating a network of resistance and hope that had ultimately proven stronger than all his accumulated power. Every choice creates a counter-choice, Dumbledore explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying the deep structures of human nature. Every act of darkness calls forth acts of light. Every moment of hatred inspires moments of love. The universe has a way of maintaining balance, Tom, and your very existence has called forth some of the greatest expressions of love and courage and self-sacrifice in the history of the wizarding world. The revelation was staggering in its implications. Tom had not just been a force of destruction in the world, but also, inadvertently, a catalyst for incredible acts of heroism and love. The very darkness he had brought into existence had inspired others to shine more brightly, to love more fiercely, to fight more courageously for the things that mattered most. But that doesn't absolve me, Tom said, struggling to understand the moral complexity of what he was seeing. The fact that others chose to respond to my cruelty with kindness doesn't make my cruelty any less real or any less wrong. Of course not, Dumbledore agreed. Your choices remain your choices, and the consequences of those choices remain real. But understanding the full picture helps us see that even the darkest choices are not the end of the story. Even the most terrible acts of evil can become the foundation for acts of good that would not have existed otherwise. The web of existence continued to pulse around them, and Tom began to see another layer of truth that was even more profound than the first. The threads of light that had been called forth in response to his darkness were not just random acts of heroism by unconnected individuals. They were part of a larger pattern, a cosmic response to the imbalance he had created in the world. More than that, he began to see that some of those threads of light were connected directly to him, flowing not from his acts of cruelty, but from the love that had been poured into him at the moment of his birth. His mother's sacrifice had created a reservoir of potential good that had been waiting his entire life for the chance to express itself. Every moment when he had chosen restraint over cruelty, every decision to spare someone when he could have killed them, every instant of mercy or compassion he had ever shown, no matter how brief or how quickly suppressed, had drawn from that reservoir. The love was still there, still real, still powerful enough to transform everything if he chose to let it. The question that remained was whether he had the courage to make that choice, to step away from the identity he had built over 7 decades and become something entirely new. The second open loop was resolving itself before his eyes as he finally understood why certain people appeared in his death vision while others didn't. The figures he encountered in this place between worlds were not random souls from his past, but the specific individuals who represented his choices most clearly. They were the ones who had offered him love and been rejected, the ones who had seen his potential for good and tried to nurture it, the ones whose deaths had created the greatest opportunities for him to feel remorse and choose differently. Each person who appeared to him was both a reminder of what he had lost and an invitation to reclaim it. McGonagall represented the teacher who had seen his brilliance and tried to guide it toward positive ends. Moore represented the unconditional love that had been his foundation from the very beginning. Dumbledore represented the wisdom that could help him understand the true nature of choice and consequence. "The choice is still yours, Tom," Dumbledore said softly. "It has always been yours at every moment of your existence. The question is not whether you deserve redemption, but whether you are willing to choose it, whether you are willing to let the love that has always been there transform you into something new." Tom looked down at the child who had been his constant companion throughout this journey and saw that the boy was no longer crying. Instead, he was looking up with an expression of infinite hope, waiting to see what the man he would become would choose in this ultimate moment of decision. The web of existence pulsed around them, showing Tom every possibility that remained open to him, every choice he could still make, every way he could honor his mother's sacrifice and transform the darkness he had created into something beautiful and healing. The ultimate secret was not what he had seen when he died, but what he was willing to see now that he understood the true nature of love and choice and the eternal possibility of redemption. The crying had stopped entirely, replaced by a silence that felt pregnant with infinite possibility. Tom Riddle stood at the center of all existence, held in the embrace of a love that had waited 70 years to finally reach him, and prepared to make the choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the very nature of what his existence would become for whatever eternity awaited him beyond the threshold of death. The mirror phrase from his journey echoed in the cosmic silence, where once there had been a whisper of remorse lost in time. Now there was the possibility for that whisper to grow into a symphony of redemption that would echo across eternity itself. The moment of choice stretched into infinity, existing outside the normal flow of time in a space where every possibility existed simultaneously until the act of choosing collapsed them into a single reality. Tom stood at the center of the web of existence, feeling the weight of 70 years of choices, pressing against the potential of what he could still become. The child who was his youngest self looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only infinite patience, and the quiet hope that perhaps, finally, someone would choose love over fear. The first open loop resolved itself as Tom knelt down beside the crying child and, for the first time in his adult life, allowed himself to feel the full weight of his own pain without trying to transform it into anger or redirect it toward others. The boy in the alcove, the source of the crying that had drawn him deeper into this impossible place, was not just a memory or a metaphor. He was the living embodiment of Tom's capacity for love, the part of himself that had been wounded so early and so deeply that everything else had grown around it like scar tissue. "I'm sorry," Tom whispered, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar on his lips. "I'm so sorry I left you alone for so long. I'm sorry I convinced myself you were weakness instead of strength. I'm sorry I tried to bury you so deep that even I forgot you existed." The child's response was not words, but simple physical contact. Small arms wrapping around Tom's neck in an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. For the first time since infancy, Tom Riddle experienced unconditional love, not as something foreign and threatening, but as the natural state of his being, the foundation upon which everything else could be built. As the embrace deepened, Tom felt something fundamental shifting inside him. A sensation like broken bones finally knitting themselves back together after decades of improper healing. The fractured pieces of his soul, scattered across time and space in objects he had thought would make him immortal, were being drawn back together by a force more powerful than any magic he had ever wielded. the simple decision to love himself enough to heal. The repository of souls around them pulsed with gentle light as other figures began to appear. But these were not the accusatory spirits he had expected. Instead, they were the people he had wronged, coming not to condemn but to witness his transformation. Myrtle Warren stood among them, her face peaceful rather than angry, her eyes holding forgiveness that Tom had never dared to hope for. "I never understood," she said softly, "why you needed to hurt me to feel powerful. But I see now that you were hurting so much yourself, that causing pain was the only way you knew how to make it stop, even temporarily." "That doesn't excuse what I did to you," Tom replied, his voice thick with emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. "Nothing can excuse that. Nothing can excuse that. Nothing can bring back the life I stole from you, the future I destroyed." "No," Myrtle agreed. "Nothing can undo what was done. But something new can be built from the ashes of what was destroyed. The question is whether you're willing to spend whatever existence remains to you trying to heal rather than continuing to harm." Other figures stepped forward. James and Lily Potter, Frank and Alice Longbottom, countless others whose lives had been cut short by his actions. But instead of the hatred and desire for vengeance that Tom had expected, they offered something far more challenging: the opportunity to make amends through service to others, to honor their memory by protecting the vulnerable rather than preying upon them. "We cannot return to life," said James Potter, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had died protecting those he loved. "But you can choose to live differently. You can choose to use whatever power remains to you, not for domination but for healing, not for self-aggrandizement but for service to others." The connection to Harry Potter mythology became clear as Tom realized that what he was being offered was the same choice that had defined every hero in the wizarding world: the decision to use one's gifts in service of others rather than in service of oneself. It was the choice Harry had made again and again, the decision to risk everything to protect people he barely knew, simply because it was right. But more than that, Tom began to understand that this choice was not just about his own redemption, but about the healing of the wizarding world itself. His very existence as the Dark Lord had created wounds in the fabric of magical society that would take generations to heal. By choosing transformation over destruction, by dedicating whatever remained of his existence to repair rather than revenge, he could begin the long process of undoing the damage he had caused. The emotional reflection that followed was the most difficult part of the entire experience. Tom was forced to confront not just what he had done, but what his actions had cost the world in terms of lost potential, destroyed relationships, and the pervasive climate of fear that had infected the magical community for decades. The bitter irony of understanding love only in death was not lost on him. The recognition that he had spent his entire life searching for the very thing he had been given at birth and had chosen to reject at every crucial moment. But understanding brought with it the possibility of change, and change brought with it the hope of redemption. The consequences of his choices would echo through the magical world for generations to come, but those echoes could be transformed from purely destructive forces into something more complex and ultimately healing. The very darkness he had brought into the world had called forth corresponding light, and now he had the opportunity to add his own light to the balance. The character completion came as Tom finally integrated all the disparate parts of himself into a coherent whole. The brilliant child who had dreamed of being loved and accepted, the wounded adolescent who had chosen power over connection, the adult who had committed terrible crimes in pursuit of an immortality that had ultimately proven illusory, and the soul who now stood at the threshold of genuine transformation. All of these were real. All of these were him, and all of these could be honored without excusing or minimizing the harm that had been done. "What happens now?" Tom asked, looking around at the assembled souls who had borne witness to his transformation. "What does redemption look like for someone who has done what I've done?"
Dumbledore stepped forward, his expression warm with the kind of pride a teacher feels when a particularly difficult student finally grasps a crucial lesson. "That, Tom, is the beautiful mystery of choice. Every moment offers new possibilities, new opportunities to serve rather than dominate, to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. The specifics matter less than the intention behind them.
The child in Tom's arms looked up at him, with eyes that were no longer filled with tears, but with something far more powerful, hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone who has nothing left to lose, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who has finally found their true home, and knows that whatever comes next, they will not have to face it alone. "We can be different now," the child said softly. "We can choose to love instead of fear, to heal instead of harm, to build instead of destroy. We can honor Mother's sacrifice by becoming the person she saw when she looked at us in those final moments." Tom nodded, feeling a peace settle over him that he had never experienced in life, a sense of completion that came not from achieving his goals but from finally understanding what his goals should have been all along. The resolution was not a dramatic transformation or a sudden reversal of everything he had done, but a quiet decision to spend whatever existence remained to him in service of healing rather than harm. The web of existence continued to pulse around them, showing Tom that his story was far from over, even though his life had ended. In this place between worlds where souls came to understand themselves completely and choose what they would become, he had been given the gift of genuine transformation, the opportunity to honor the love that had been poured into him at birth by pouring that same love back into the world. The repository of souls began to fade around them, but not because the experience was ending. Rather, it was transforming into something new, a space where Tom could begin the long work of redemption, surrounded by the souls of those he had wronged, but who had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, healing over hatred. As the first open loop closed completely, Tom understood that the crying child had not been a source of weakness, but the key to his salvation. By finally acknowledging and embracing the wounded part of himself, by choosing to heal rather than hide the fundamental wound of abandonment, he had opened the door to genuine transformation and the possibility of spending eternity, not in isolation and regret, but in connection and service to others. The resolution was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Tom Riddle had finally found his way home to the love that had been waiting for him all along, and now he could begin the long journey of learning how to share that love with a universe that desperately needed healing. The transformation that had taken place at the heart of the web of existence left Tom feeling fundamentally altered in ways that went far beyond anything he had experienced during his attempts at physical resurrection. This was not the crude reconstruction of flesh and bone that had marked his return to corporeal form, but something infinitely more profound, the resurrection of his capacity for genuine human connection, dormant for 7 decades, but never truly destroyed. As the cosmic vision of interconnected choices faded around him, Tom found himself back in the impossible garden where his journey had begun. But everything was different now. The starlight that bathed the ancient oak tree seemed warmer, more welcoming, carrying with it not the cold light of distant suns but the gentle radiance of souls who had found their way home to love. The air itself felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had been pressing down on everything had finally been lifted. The child who was his younger self no longer sat apart from him on the bench, separated by decades of accumulated pain and carefully constructed defenses. Instead, the boy had become integrated into Tom's being in a way that felt natural and healing rather than threatening. The wounded, crying child was still there, would always be there as a reminder of the pain that had shaped his early choices, but now that child was held and comforted rather than abandoned and denied. Other figures began to materialize in the garden, but their presence felt different from the intense revelations of the cosmic web. These were souls who had come not to teach or challenge or transform, but simply to witness the beginning of Tom's healing process and offer their support for the long journey ahead. Minerva McGonagall was among the first to appear, but she was not the stern professor he remembered from Hogwarts. Instead, she radiated the warmth and maternal energy that she had always possessed beneath her professional exterior, the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to fight so hard against the darkness he had brought into the world. I always knew, she said softly, settling onto the bench beside him, with the easy familiarity of someone who had waited decades for this conversation. Even in your darkest moments, even when you were at your most cruel and calculating, I could see glimpses of the boy you had been. The brilliant child who had come to Hogwarts with such hope, such potential for greatness. Tom felt tears on his cheeks. A sensation so foreign that for a moment he didn't recognize what was happening. When had he last cried? He could not remember ever allowing himself such vulnerability, such open acknowledgement of pain and loss and regret. I wasted it all, he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of accumulated sorrow. All that potential, all those opportunities to choose differently, to be the person you saw in me. I threw it all away because I was too afraid to trust, too wounded to believe that love could be real. McGonagall reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and her touch carried with it all the comfort and guidance he had rejected as a student, all the maternal care he had been too proud and too frightened to accept. You didn't waste it, Tom, she said firmly. You delayed it, yes. You took a very long and very painful detour. But potential doesn't disappear just because it's unused. It waits, sometimes for decades, sometimes for lifetimes, but it waits. And now, finally, you're ready to claim what was always yours to begin with. The healing that was taking place went far beyond the personal. Tom began to understand that his transformation was having ripple effects throughout the magical world. Even though his physical death meant he could no longer directly influence events in the realm of the living, the very fact that he had chosen redemption over defiance, healing over hatred, was creating waves of positive energy that would touch lives in ways he might never fully comprehend. Recovery, he realized, was not a destination, but a process. One that would continue for whatever eternity awaited him in this space between worlds. Each moment of choosing love over fear, each decision to serve rather than dominate, each act of genuine remorse and commitment to healing would be another step on a journey that had no end but offered infinite opportunities for growth and service. More figures appeared in the garden as the hours or days or years passed, time having no meaning in this place where souls came to understand themselves completely. Some were people he had known in life, others were souls he had never encountered but who had been affected by his choices in ways both direct and indirect. Each brought with them a piece of wisdom, a fragment of understanding, a gift of forgiveness that helped Tom comprehend the true magnitude of what redemption could mean. Severus Snape materialized near the ancient oak tree. But he was not the bitter, conflicted man Tom remembered from life. Instead, he radiated the peace that came from having finally reconciled the competing loyalties that had torn him apart for so many years. The love for Lily Potter that had driven him to both serve and betray the Dark Lord in an agonizing dance of divided loyalty. I spent so many years hating you for what you took from me, Severus said, his voice free of the venom that had characterized their interactions in life. But I understand now that you were as much a prisoner of your choices as I was of mine. We were both trapped by our inability to believe that we deserved love, both convinced that we had to earn affection through service to causes greater than ourselves. The conversation that followed was one of the most healing Tom had experienced since arriving in this place. For the first time he was able to understand Severus not as a useful servant or a potential threat, but as a fellow soul who had been wounded early and deeply, who had spent his life trying to find ways to matter, to be valued, to prove that his existence had meaning. We were both looking for home, Tom realized, the insight hitting him with the force of revelation. Both searching for a place where we would be accepted and valued for who we truly were, not just for what we could do or provide. The difference was that you found it, eventually, in your love for Lily and your commitment to protecting Harry. I kept looking in all the wrong places. The wisdom integration that was taking place felt like a gentle rewiring of his entire understanding of existence. Every conversation, every moment of forgiveness received and offered, every glimpse of the life he might have lived if he had chosen differently. was adding another layer to his comprehension of what it meant to be truly alive, truly connected, truly home. Relationship resolution came gradually as more figures from his past appeared to offer forgiveness and closure. Not all of them, Tom understood, were ready or willing to engage with him yet. Some wounds were too deep, some pain too profound, some loss too overwhelming to be addressed in this initial phase of his transformation, but enough souls extended the gift of reconciliation to begin the healing process, to show him that redemption was not just possible but actively supported by forces of love and compassion that transcended individual grievances. The return to normalcy, such as it was in this extraordinary place, involved Tom beginning to understand the rhythm and purpose of existence in the space between worlds. This was not a place of eternal punishment or reward, but a realm of infinite possibility, where souls could continue to grow and learn and serve regardless of the choices they had made during their time in physical form. He learned that many of the souls he encountered here spent their existence helping other newly arrived spirits navigate their own transformations, offering guidance and support to those who were struggling to understand the true nature of choice and consequence. It was a form of service that appealed to Tom profoundly, the opportunity to use his hard-won wisdom to spare others some of the pain he had inflicted on himself and the world through his ignorance and fear. The living world continued to turn without him, but his influence was not entirely gone. In ways both subtle and profound, his choice of redemption over destruction was affecting the magical community he had terrorized for so long. The very fact that even the darkest soul could choose transformation was becoming part of the collective unconscious of the wizarding world, offering hope to those who had given up on the possibility of change and inspiring mercy in those who had hardened their hearts against forgiveness. As Tom sat in the impossible garden surrounded by souls who had chosen to support his healing rather than demand vengeance for his crimes, he began to understand that the aftermath of transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. The real work of redemption lay ahead, in the countless small choices to serve rather than dominate, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than tear them down. The garden pulsed with gentle light around him, and Tom Riddle prepared to begin the next phase of his existence, not as the Dark Lord who had terrorized the wizarding world, but as a soul committed to healing the wounds he had caused and preventing others from walking the same dark path he had traveled for so many years. The aftermath was peaceful, but it was also purposeful, filled with infinite opportunities to grow and serve and love in ways he had never imagined possible during his time in the realm of the living. The impossible garden had become Tom's sanctuary, a place where time moved like honey through warm summer air, and every breath carried with it the accumulated peace of souls who had finally found their way home. The ancient oak tree under which he spent much of his time had grown somehow, its branches reaching higher into the star-filled sky, its roots extending deeper into the rich earth of possibility. It was as if the tree itself was responding to the healing that had taken place here, growing stronger and more beautiful with each moment of genuine transformation. The King's Cross station, that twisted reflection of crossing between worlds, had undergone its own metamorphosis. What had once been a place of confusion and pain, where the architecture shifted according to the observer's wounds and fears, had become something far more welcoming. The Victorian ironwork now gleamed with warm golden light. The platforms stretched in orderly lines toward destinations that promised hope rather than judgment, and the air itself hummed with the gentle music of souls at peace. The trains that had been absent during Tom's initial arrival now moved regularly through the station, carrying passengers between different realms of existence with the smooth efficiency of a system designed by love rather than logic. Some souls were departing for new adventures, new opportunities to learn and grow and serve in ways that transcended anything possible in physical form. Others were arriving, newly deceased spirits who needed guidance and support as they navigated their own transformation from the fears and limitations of mortality to the infinite possibilities of spiritual existence. Tom had found his purpose in this new existence. though it bore no resemblance to the grand ambitions that had driven him during his time as the Dark Lord. Instead of seeking dominion over others, he had become a guide for souls who arrived in this space carrying the same wounds that had shaped his own journey toward darkness. The boy who had never received the love he desperately needed, the adolescent who had chosen power over connection, the adult who had convinced himself that fear was stronger than love, all of these versions of himself had become resources he could draw upon to help others avoid the same tragic mistakes. The cosmic visuals that surrounded him had settled into a gentle rhythm of renewal and rebirth. The harsh light of absolute revelation had softened into something more sustainable, a warm glow that illuminated truth without overwhelming those who were not yet ready to see it completely. The web of interconnected choices still existed, still pulsed with the accumulated consequences of every decision ever made, but now it felt less like a judgment and more like a teaching tool, a way of understanding how individual actions rippled outward to affect the entire fabric of existence. Tom's reflections on the endless cycle of knowledge and loss had led him to a profound understanding of the true nature of existence. Every soul who arrived in this place brought with them both wisdom gained through experience and innocence lost through the inevitable pain of living. The challenge was to honor both the knowledge and the loss, to use the wisdom to help others while grieving appropriately for the innocence that could never be recovered. He thought often of Harry Potter, the boy who had become the living symbol of love's triumph over hatred. In the most profound irony of his entire existence, Tom had come to understand that Harry represented everything he himself could have become if he had made different choices at crucial moments. The boy who lived had faced abandonment, abuse, loss, and the weight of enormous responsibility, but had chosen again and again to respond with courage and compassion rather than bitterness and revenge. The legacy themes that occupied much of Tom's contemplation centered around the question of how his story would be remembered and retold in the world of the living. Would he be remembered only as the Dark Lord, the symbol of ultimate evil whose very name was feared by an entire generation? Or would there be room in the collective memory for the more complex truth of his transformation, the possibility that even the darkest soul could choose redemption? He suspected that the full truth of his journey would not be understood for many years, perhaps many generations. The living world needed time to heal from the wounds he had inflicted before it would be ready to grapple with the more challenging concepts of forgiveness and redemption for those who had committed terrible crimes. But seeds of that understanding were already being planted in the conversations between those who had known him and witnessed his final transformation, in the gradual shift from vengeance to justice to mercy that always followed great conflicts. The cyclical nature of existence had become clear to Tom in ways that transcended his academic understanding of magic and mortality. Every generation faced the same fundamental choices between love and fear, between connection and isolation, between service and domination. The specific challenges might change, the circumstances might vary, but the essential decision remained constant. Would each soul choose to add light to the world or to increase the darkness? Other mysteries awaited in the vast universe of spiritual existence, some of which Tom was only beginning to glimpse. There were realms beyond this peaceful intermediate space, dimensions of experience that existed outside anything describable in human language or comprehensible to minds shaped by physical existence. But these mysteries did not call to him with the same desperate hunger that had driven his pursuit of magical knowledge during life. Instead, he felt content to let understanding come gradually, naturally, as part of his continued growth and service to others. The gentle invitation to continue exploring these deeper mysteries felt different from any ambition he had known during life. It was not driven by ego or the need to possess knowledge, but by genuine curiosity and the desire to become more capable of helping souls who were struggling with their own transformations. Every new understanding was not a prize to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared, another tool in the endless work of healing and guidance. Final atmospheric descriptions painted the peaceful scene that had become Tom's eternal present. The garden existed in a state of perpetual twilight, with stars that seemed close enough to touch scattered across a sky that stretched infinitely upward. The flowers that bloomed here were varieties that existed nowhere in the physical world, their colors more vivid than anything possible under earthly physics, their fragrances carrying memories of every beautiful moment that had ever existed. The sound of water was constant but never overwhelming, streams and fountains that flowed with liquid light rather than ordinary water, creating music that spoke directly to the soul without needing to pass through the ears. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere beyond the garden's boundaries, souls who had died young but had been welcomed into a realm where innocence could be preserved and nurtured rather than corrupted by experience. The slowest, dreamiest pacing had settled over everything, a rhythm that matched the deep breathing of souls at rest, rather than the frantic urgency of minds driven by fear and ambition. Time moved here, not in the linear progression of cause and effect, but in the circular flow of seasons and generations, the eternal return of opportunities to choose love over fear, healing over harm, connection over isolation. Maximum emotional closure came not from any dramatic resolution or final revelation, but from the simple recognition that he was finally and completely home. The child who had cried for so many years had been comforted. The wounds that had driven him to such darkness had been healed. The love that had been poured into him at birth had finally been allowed to flourish and grow. Tom Riddle sat beneath his ancient oak tree in the impossible garden, surrounded by souls who had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, watching the gentle trains carry passengers between realms of infinite possibility. The boy who had become a monster had learned, at last, to become a man. The whisper of remorse that had been lost in time for so many years had grown into a symphony of redemption that would echo through eternity, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, offering hope to every soul who had ever believed themselves beyond the reach of love. The peaceful conclusion was not an ending, but a transformation, not a destination, but a new beginning in a journey that would continue forever, guided always by the simple understanding that love was indeed the most powerful force in any universe, capable of healing any wound, transforming any soul, and offering hope to even the darkest corners of existence. The crying had stopped long ago, replaced by the gentle music of souls at peace, and Tom Riddle slept the sleep of the redeemed under stars that sang lullabies of infinite forgiveness and eternal love.